Thanks. Welcome back, everyone, for the the fifth day of the SciFM 24 Summer School. Um, Today we'll have a very exciting series of talks on um, RAG and agents, and then a discussion of the state of the art later in the afternoon. All right, I'm excited to have Ozan present about retrieval augmented generation. Ozan, take it away.
Sure. You can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the uh, end of the first week of the SciFM Summer School. My name is Ozan Gokdemir. I'm a computer science PhD student at the University of Chicago. I also have a joint appointment as a research aide at Argonne National Laboratory. And my research spans um, broadly large language models, specifically advanced techniques like retrieval augmented generation and its applications to scientific computing in the domains of protein design, drug discovery, um, and biomedical literature extraction. So today I'm going to talk about retrieval augmented generation. But before I get started with that, I would like everybody to picture in their mind the thickest textbook they've ever studied from. So for me, this was the freshman year of college, and it was this calculus book here from James Stewart. And this is a 1,400-page book. And now it's a brick of a book, as you guys can see. So I would like you to picture a scenario where I'm going to give you enough time to sit down in one sitting and read as much of this book as you can possibly read, assuming you don't know any calculus prior. And left to right, cover to cover, you're reading as much of it as you possibly can, but the rule is that you cannot go back to the previous page. Okay, so when your time is up, however many pages that you've finished, read in the book, I'm going to put you through a calculus exam. And there's going to be integral calculus, differential calculus, Taylor expansions, you name it. The entire calculus is in there. And what are your chances of when I put a series of questions in front of you, and that was the first time you've ever read that book? What are your chances of answering every question accurately, assuming that you're responsible from the entire book? Well, now imagine another scenario where we have a new Newton among us, and there's this big new discovery in calculus. But this book here was printed, even this edition of it, I think, was printed 10 years ago. So this new finding is not in this book, but you're responsible for answering it in the exam. So, you would obviously hallucinate pretty much, guess and answer to get a couple of points from the progress, right? So this is exactly how we train LLMs. We show them text from a left to right setting. Usually they don't get to see the entire data because we don't have the budget or the time. And they're often responsible for answering knowledge, not just calculus, but maybe also material science, biology, and chemistry. They have to be, let's say, a scientific foundation model. Retrieval augmented generation is a technique that would allow you to not only present this calculus book to the model, but also create an external data source of many textbooks and put splitters between pages, separating each book by topic, so that when the model is asked a question or the student is asked a question, they can take a look and see, oh, this is a material science question. Let me pull up the material science textbook. Let me go to the page with the topic that's specifically relevant to this particular question, open up that page so I don't have to read the whole book, and read maybe 2 or 3 pages in that topic so that I can answer the question properly and accurately. So that is retrieval augmented generation. And like we presented in this scenario, we need it for 5 reasons. One, LLMs being probabilistic models, they suffer from hallucinations. And they might present answers that look seemingly correct, syntactically perfect, maybe intuitively plausible, nonetheless inaccurate or outdated or biased. Also, another challenge with LLMs is that when new knowledge becomes available, especially in quickly evolving domains, like in new scientific findings or new news articles coming in, updating the knowledge of the large language model is not trivial. You have to implement some sort of fine-tuning scheme. But fine-tuning tends to suffer from catastrophic forgetting, and it's more of an art than a science. Obviously, there's a lot of math to it, but you need to have a lot of empirical experience to get it right, because you can forget what the model already knew prior to that fine-tuning. Also, in this day and age we're living in the LLM world today, you have to be a pretty well-funded entity with lots of resources, manpower, compute, time, money, to train a state-of-the-art large language model. And if you're that kind of entity, you probably want this model to appeal to as broad a client, customer, user base as possible. Therefore, you want to have as diverse a data set as you possibly can. And when you do that, you tend to sacrifice from domain specificity of that training data. So think about the letter T, right? There's a breadth, the horizontal axis, and a depth, the vertical axis. You're going a lot of breadth and not a lot of depth for any topic. So when you ask this kind of a LLM, a general foundation model, very specific domain questions like the kind an experienced scientist would ask, there's a good chance that the model did not have that specific piece of information in its training data. And finally, LLMs, like many deep learning models, are black box models that offer little interpretability to their responses. They might present a piece of information, but there's often not a citation for where it comes from unless some technique is implemented to provide for that. So think about it. I want to elucidate this hallucination scenario a little bit with a simple example. Now imagine I'm a scientist and I work on these on this topic called antimicrobial peptides. Antimicrobial peptides are think about them as smaller proteins that have various functions in the human body. Specifically for the antimicrobial peptides, this is immune function. Okay, so every organism pretty much produces antimicrobial peptides. Your body too. And one of them is called defensin, okay? And now I want the model to explain to me, how does defensin contribute to immune response in plants? And now I'm also asking for a citation to ground the answer. And the model comes back saying, oh, defensin in plants contributes to the immune response by enhancing the production of antibodies that target and neutralize pathogens. Okay, well, if you look at it, it looks like it could be plausible, right? I mean, if you don't know your domain, if you're, say, a pure computer scientist and don't know much about plant biology or antimicrobial peptides, it could make sense to you. There's even a citation, so you think, oh, yeah, this is the answer. This is the way to go. You copy paste that answer, maybe put it in your homework, or maybe you guide the next step in your research based on this information. But see, if you actually copy paste the source that is cited by the model, go to Google, what you will see is that there is no such paper. The source and the information that was provided here is an hallucination. It is just a token by token. It's a next token prediction task when you're generating with an LLM. And these happen to be the most probable next tokens, or concatenation of most probable next tokens at each step. That came out as the answer to this question. Just because they're most probable does not mean they're factually accurate. And this is the definition of hallucination. Just one takeaway from this talk is most probable next token will not always produce a factually accurate answer or unbiased answer or up-to-date answer. Okay, it's just a conditional probability based on the prompt and what the model has already generated iteratively in previous steps. And it's all there is to it. A conditional probability modeled from the data that the model is trained on. So it reflects all the biases, all the outdated information, or lack thereof of good information in that training data. But what could we do? And this is the sort of the spirit of RAG. What could we do to remedy the situation? So what if we were able to introduce to this large language model that is trained on its pre-trained data a piece of external information? Okay, so I'm this scientist. I'm asking exact same question to the model again, but this time the model has access to a corpus of scientific papers. And one of them happens to talk about how antimicrobial peptides like defensin contribute to immune response. And in the gist of it, what it's saying that antimicrobial peptide wraps around the cell membrane like a blanket, therefore blocking any blocking its biochemical access to in and out. So nothing comes in and out of the cell, and this disrupts the chemical balance of the membrane and therefore kills the pathogen. Okay, so like a carpet-like blocker that kills the pathogen. So when I introduce this information to the LLM and allow it to retrieve this relevant piece of information to answer this scientist's query, my query, then I can get to an answer that says, yeah, antimicrobial peptide contributes to the immune response by disrupting the integrity of fungal cell membranes. And here is a source, which happens to be an actual source because the source is where the paper that was retrieved, what you're reading on the left of this page. So this is retrieval augmented generation. So let's break down its anatomy. Okay, how does it work? Anatomy of a RAG system. You start by, as you saw, a raw data sources. So this is your external knowledge corpus. It could be PubMed, Archive, Wikipedia, a domain-specific data set in your field of science, whatever it is, okay, that you need to introduce to the model. Now, there's a high chance that this data is in a format that you can't directly tokenize and feed into an LLM. It could be in JSON files, HTML, if you web scraped, or it could be in PDFs if you're working with scientific papers. You need to parse the clean text out of that data, so of this data format, file format. And for that, you need to use something like either something OCR based like Robit, or you can use NuGut. That I'll talk more in detail. It's a vision transformer architecture. So you go from PDF to the text, clean text representation. Then when you get all this text, you can't feed all of the text into the LLM because you have a narrow context window. Well, recently there are lots of developments there, but assuming you have a fixed context window, and for each token that you input into that context window, you're suffering a quadratic complexity due to the nature of self-attention, assuming a vanilla self-attention implementation. So you need to chunk this text into digestible chunks. So you could either go fixed size, say like I will take every 500 word, that will be my window. There will be some overlap between them. Or you can go structural, such as I will split it into paragraphs, or you could do something like semantic chunking, which is what I would recommend. I think is the state of the art. And I will talk more about it in detail. Semantic chunking is not heuristic based, but it creates chunks of text that are self-contained and coherent. So the whole chunk is talking about from beginning to the end at the same line of thought. Okay. So once your chunking is done, you embed these chunks. That is, you feed them into an LLM to gain a vector representation of this text. So when you're feeding this into an embedding, there are a few things that you have to take into consideration, such as your encoder will have to be pre-trained on a data distribution that is similar to the one you expect in this text, a token distribution that you expect in this text. For instance, you can't take a model trained on, I don't know, for sentiment analysis on X posts and expect to have quality encodings from that for neuroscience papers, okay? And you also need to make sure that each chunk actually fits into the context window of that encoder. But once you get your embeddings, you put them in a vector database. So this is nothing but another database that is optimized at the hardware level for fast lookups, fast vector operations that power this thing that we call semantic search, which comes into play when the user asks a question. You encode that question into a vector representation. Here is the most important part, perhaps, of this whole slide. The encoder that you're using here for encoding your question has to be the same encoder that you use for encoding your documents, your chunks. Therefore, they're both yellow arrows. That's what that color coding is annotating here. So once you get the embedding of the question, you perform semantic search. Think about this as a, since you're in a vector space, in a latent space right now, you're representing text, raw text as vectors, you can do math. And that math allows you to compute a distance between the vector representations of two texts, which might suggest some sort of semantic similarity between them. Perhaps they're talking about the same thing, right? Hence a closer, like in a vector space, mathematically closer representation. This metric could be cosine similarity or L2 distance. It could be a custom metric that it's learned, some mathematical function of distance, okay? So based on that distance, you retrieve top k nearest neighbors of that question embedding in your vector database, right? Let's say, let me get the 10 nearest neighbors, 10 vectors that are closest to this, or and the chunks that these nearest neighbor vectors are encoding. So this is how to say your mathematical way of pulling 10 most relevant chunks to this query. And once you get at this information is called retrieval, hence retrieval augmented generation. You feed the relevant data into the LLM along with the prompt. This can either be inflating some prompt template, saying something like, oh, here is my question, you're a scientist, below is some context that's provided to you, and context is what's retrieved, question is what the user query is. Or it could simply be a concatenation of question plus retrieved context. And you feed that into the LLM to get a response.
Just a quick question here.
So
Go ahead. Yeah, could you go back the slide? So in terms of the retrieving the top but most relevant data, it seems like how do you make sure that it doesn't just get from the same document, like that you're getting a diversity of responses, or like of like perspectives on a thing? because like a lot of times, like when I'm doing like a literature search, right? Like I don't want, like, yes, I do want like the most relevant thing, and I don't want like not relevant queries, but I do kind of want, I don't want to basically be pulling from like necessarily the same document or from like the same kind of like collection of space.
Yeah.
If that makes
No,
sense.
I understand. Okay. How do you allow for diversity? That's a good question. So usually these vector databases are, how to say, pretty they're highly optimized for fast vector lookup. Therefore, you have to do something outside of that semantic search, L2 distance or cosine similarity lookup. So what you can do is associate some sort of metadata. So, okay, what I mean by the previous thing is like when you go to this vector database, you're not going to get actual text. You're going to get an ID associated with a vector. And this is usually an unsigned integer of 16 bits. Okay, that's how bare metal these things are to fit into RAM and optimize the lookup. Okay, so once you get that ID, you will use that ID to go to an actual database. Think about that as the primary key in an actual SQL database with perhaps the metadata of the information and the actual raw text. Okay, in that metadata, you can have, I don't know, another unique key for the paper ID. Okay, and once you retrieve this information, you can write a piece of code, a deterministic piece of code that removes, well, let's say out of 10, if 4 of them or 6 of them come from the same document, you can run the lookup again and pull in new documents, like encode the query again and run new documents. But like that's one way I would do, is like handling this outside of the cosine similarity and L2 distance. Another way of doing it is you can add minimal Gaussian noise to the encoding of your question, run the query maybe 5 or 6 times, like this semantic search 5 or 6 times or n times, and then sort of accumulate the answers and write a piece of code that samples a diverse set from those 5 different runs. These are 2 strategies I would go about for that. Are we good?
Thank you. And then I guess one other thing, so you mentioned with the embeddings that it's important that the model has some degree of like domain expertise. Does this kind of produce like a nice little like chicken and the egg problem, where if like the new, Newton comes out and puts out their paper, their new calculus, that the model doesn't necessarily have a good job of doing embeddings, or is it just not like super sensitive to that type of?
No, I mean, what I mean by that is you need to have at least a tokenizer, right? That can encode that specific scientific terms.
Gotcha.
Yeah, something along the lines of that. I mean, it will definitely help you if you have, say, if you're working with biomedical text, if you have something like PubMed BERT, which is a BERT model pre-trained on PubMed Central. Or, if you're encoding COVID-19 data set with like LNAI Institute's COVID papers, there's a COVID, they actually took the BERT-based 330 million model and they pre-trained it on 140,000 COVID papers. You're much better off going with that model as your encoder to get a representation of chunks from COVID papers than something, again, trained on, I don't know, internet scale data. But see, this is an open question in research. Do you want to go with a smaller, more nimble domain expert model? Or do you want to go with a large, complex, maybe 10 billion parameter general domain model? What is the impact of domain expertise in the encoding quality for retrieval is an open science question. So if you want to go explore that, you could write a paper on it still. My experience, our team's experience, is that domain expertise makes up for slower model capacity in terms of parameters. So you can run smaller models faster and cheaper if they have some data distribution overlap, okay, with what you're trying to encode.
Thank you.
All right. Of course, you're welcome. So obviously this looks all cool and interesting. You can, the retrieval augmented generation, you can input into the model arbitrary sources in and out. But what are the limitations? See, as you can see here, there are many moving parts, right? There is parsing, there's chunking, indexing, semantic search. Then you feed them into an LLM. So many moving parts, so many components, which means so many hyperparameters to tune, so many knobs to turn, which means many points of failure in the system. It's a very heterogeneous system, as you can see, multi-component. Not an end-to-end algorithm, okay? Very modular, not monolithic. So therefore, you know, there are many limitations associated with it. You need to have a lot of expertise getting each part right. One of them is getting the knowledge extraction right. So this parsing step here. Can you see my cursor? Can you people see my cursor?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. So it's this knowledge extraction part. You need to get clean text out of your papers. Otherwise, you know, garbage in, garbage out. Then fixed size chunking at the chunking step might lead to incomplete and incoherent sentences, especially if you're doing like every 800 characters is a chunk. Okay, maybe your first chunk is going to be the beginning of a sentence, but who knows where it's going to end after 800 characters, maybe in the middle of another sentence. Okay, you cut them out. Then the next chunk is going to start from the middle of that sentence and go until who knows when. That's another chunk. You see, what you end up getting is a bunch of text that starts where you don't know. I mean, it's not clear where it will start, where it will end. Okay, that's why I recommend semantic chunking, and I'll show it in the notebook too. Embeddings might lack sufficient semantic signal. We talked a little bit about encoder and the domain expertise. One thing about it, semantic search tends to be suboptimal in precise keyword queries. Like if you're specifically looking for defensive or like one, how to say, keyword specific query, what happens is that you encode the whole prompt, okay, along with that keyword in it into one vector representation through pooling, okay? You tokenize it. For each token, you have an embedding vector. Then you pool them in the sequence length dimension to get a single vector representing that whole prompt, the whole question, which means you're diluting each token in it. That is, the token or tokens that are encoding your specific keyword gets averaged out, like pooled with the rest of the tokens, which means for exact keyword searches, semantic search or RAG may not be the way to go. Okay. You know, and the naive RAG in the way that we described, we said top-end documents, right? See, it's a trade-off, how many documents you want to retrieve and how many documents, how accurate an answer you want to get. You can't retrieve the entire data source, right? Even if you run in parallel, there's some cost to it, and it beats the purpose of RAG. So you're, by definition, by the nature of the method, you're sort of narrow focused, okay? You're sort of honed in on 10 documents or 15 or an arbitrary number of documents, much less than total size of the data set. So when you ask a global question, say, you know, what is, you know, something as simple as what is this data set about, or what are the general themes in this data set? You may not get good global answers. That would require a broad sort of zoomed out look at the whole data set, okay? So these are the limitations of RAG, and here are some advanced techniques to address them. Number one is we talked about parsing, right? Going from something like PDF to text, raw text chunks. See, to do that, you need a quality model. It could either be a vision transformer, like the one that's Nougat that I'm presenting here. Not our work. This is from Meta, Fletcher et al. Or some sort of convolution model like YOLO V6 that draws boxes around objects in the paper, like the abstract, title, author, whatnot. So the Nougat that we use in our research is a Swin transformer. So it takes the PDF and it splits it into pages. Then it tokenizes. You guys talked about vision transformers a few days ago, I think, in this summer school. It tokenizes each image patch by patch. Okay, so each of those patches, they go get encoded. They go get fed into this architecture called the Swin transformer into a latent representation, a vector. And from that vector, you use a transformer decoder to get the text that is in those patches, that is in those pages. So this is quality parsing. Number one, it's one of the legs that RAG stands on. The second thing is chunking. You need to get clear chunks that talk about the same idea within one, self-contained chunks, okay? And here's an algorithm to do that called semantic chunking. But we actually, I co-invented an early version of this at Google last summer. And we were, before we could release it, we got somebody else that already, before we could patent it, let me say, somebody else already open sourced a variant. So the way this works is you go from sentence 1 to sentence 6. Let's say this is a part of your paper, okay? You set a parameter called buffer, a hyperparameter called buffer that tells you the number of neighbors that you will take to the left and right of each sentence, assuming they're present. So if for buffer size of 1, you take each sentence, its left neighbor, its right neighbor, assuming they're present. So for sentence 1, since there is no left neighbor, you take itself and its right neighbor. Sentence 2, you obviously take left, right, and itself. You go for the rest of them like that, okay? So these are called buffers, okay? So say in this case, sentence 1, 2, and 3 is a buffer, okay? You feed those buffers through an encoder to get a vector representation for them, okay? Then you compute for each neighbor buffer encoding at distance, say cosine similarity, okay? So this buffer and this buffer's distance, then this buffer and this buffer's distance, everyone to the right, okay? And you look at all of the distances that you computed and you set a cutoff, say, what is the 95th percentile of this distribution of distances, okay? And then you set that 95th percentile of distances, on the higher end, as a cutoff. Say, if two embeddings are more than this much distance away from each other, they're talking about different things. And I'm gonna put a cutoff here. They will be on two different chunks, okay? So this is semantic chunking. So you put these cutoff points, let's say distance between this buffer's encoding, this vector here, and this buffer's encoding were above the 95th percentile of all distances. So you put a cutoff here. The same way you put a cutoff here, and you end up getting sentence 1 is in one chunk, sentence 2 and 4 are in chunks, 5 and 6 are in chunks. And sort of a line of thought is preserved within the chunk. yeah, if anyone has any questions about it, please go for it. This is semantic chunking. I highly recommend you use it. There's also this idea of re-ranking, okay? So this is the broad RAG workflow. When we zoom into this side, we'll talk about re-ranking. So we set, let's say, that k nearest neighbor search during retrieval to 10. We got, or yeah, in this figure here, 5. Let's say we got 5 relevant documents, okay? But our context window would allow for fitting only 2 relevant document chunks, okay? How do we pick and choose, right? That's re-ranking, okay? And there are a few strategies for doing it. One, you take each retrieved 5 chunk, then you feed them into an LLM. This is an intermediary LLM, okay? And that preferably runs pretty fast. Then you ask it this question. Please write a question based on this passage. So you're reversing the problem, you see? You're not trying to write an answer giving the passage. You're trying to ask the original question, user's question, based on the passage. So you generate 5 questions from each retrieved passage, okay? And then you compute their distance to the original question. Generated questions distance to the original question. And you pick, you sort based on that, and however many you can afford to use, you use the top n, okay? That's option 1. Option 2 is relevance generation, which is more straightforward. You feed the passage and the question to an LLM and say, is this passage relevant? Or say something like, you know, prompt engineer, something like, oh, give me a score from 0 to 100 for how relevant this passage is to this question. And you sort based on that. Third is a permutation generation. You give all of the, and this is a single call, it's a bit cheaper, although perhaps a harder task for an LLM. You give all 5 passages to the LLM and say, here is my question. Can you sort these passages based on relevance? And that's permutation generation. So LLM does the whole thing in a single call. Again, I find it a bit escapist to just say, hey, LLM, go do this like a magic wand. But one method that's proposed, okay? So we talked a little bit about what RAG is, why we need it, what are its limitations, what are some techniques to address them, and now I'm gonna talk a bit about its advantages. You see, as we talked, you know, we can plug in an external data source on the fly here to improve factuality and ground, you know, answers and citations. When new knowledge comes in, it can be plugged right in. Outdated and biased knowledge can be removed, you know, without modifying the LLM, without fine-tuning. Then, you know, the same backbone generator LLM, it generates the answers. Can go from an expert biologist to a material scientist without further training. And, you know, so domain shift is possible. You can take the same backbone foundation model and use it for many different domains without having to do with changing anything about with the underlying model or its weights. Also, you know, LLM generated responses can be more diverse by adding additional resources into RAG reference database. So maybe the content that couldn't make it into the initial pre-training data scoop can be introduced to the model to make the answers more diverse, which is very helpful in endeavors like science. So I'm going to finish with a few case studies. So one way we're using RAG is this workflow where we are trying to predict viral host protein-protein interaction prediction. So what do I mean by that? Every time you get infected by a virus, by a pathogen, the chances are quite high that a protein on that pathogen is interacting with a protein in your system to either infect you or to replicate the virus, and predicting the interaction between a viral and a host protein opens the door for developing a cure, because now you have a target that you can go after on the pathogen. And our question is, can we use retrieval augmented generation to bring in the order of tens of millions of microbiology papers, virology papers, epidemiology papers, like domain corpus, and from that domain corpus infer likely but not yet experimentally validated or scientifically annotated interactions between a viral protein and a host protein. So like the way this goes is you take your corpus, you feed it into RAG. RAG generates a bunch of hypotheses. Your prompt is something like, oh, protein X, which is a viral protein, is known to interact with host proteins Y, Z, and Q. Okay. What else? What other protein could it be interacting with? So you retrieve papers about X, Y, Z, and Q, and viral host protein interactions in general. Based on that, you generate an hypothesis. Hypothesis, gives you two proteins. You fold them with something like ESM fold or AlphaFold 3. You run some MD simulations, and in a way, you in silico validate this hypothesis. And that's your structural validation. And if there's any promise, you can go into in vivo, like actual wet lab validation. The same way we were looking into antimicrobial. So this is the hypothesis generation part. We were also looking antimicrobial peptide repurposing. So we generate a bunch of prompts from a set of antimicrobial peptides we were interested in. We asked the model what bacterial strains does, say, HBD1 act on, encode it, retrieve chunks, combine them with the question, which is red here, and each retrieved chunk from the corpus go into an LLM. LLM generates a bunch of hypotheses. Then you look at those, how many of them are already annotated, how many of them are not. When something is not annotated, not in an actual database, there are two options. One, it is an hallucination. Two, which is more exciting, it's a new piece of scientific finding. It's a feasible hypothesis, and you develop workflows to test, like the one that I just described for viral host proteins. You develop workflows, maybe plug these hypotheses into self-driving labs in an agentic workflow, like Nick is going to talk about after me, to test in the lab in an automated, human out-of-the-loop way these hypotheses that an LLM is generating with the help of RAG. Okay, so automated science. And we are looking at whether defensin is effective on Fusobacterium nucleatum, using this method. It's an early result, so I don't want to talk more than that about it. Well, this was my talk. Thank you so much for listening. Here are my email addresses. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And I don't know how am I doing on time. I also have a notebook for you guys, but
Yeah, no, we're good. Keep going. Yeah, you have another 15 or so minutes, and we have a break, so you have time.
Sounds good. Okay, so I have a quick notebook we can go over together. You can see the screen, right? Still? And you guys see the notebook? Perfect.
Yes.
Perfect. So, yeah, I'm gonna let you let this is basically talking about the content of my talk. So, we will go ahead and install the packages. This Hugging Face token won't work anymore. And that's intentional. So this is not a live demo. So we're installing the packages, and then we will clone a repository which has a bunch of papers in it. And those papers contain specific piece of information that the model did not see. Mainly, they're talking about this new method called Rosetta Fold, which is for 3D protein structure prediction. We download. I said we clone the repo with the papers in, and when we do that, we will get a directory with PDFs. Okay, a few PDFs that talk about this method and its use cases. So for this, to do this RAG example, there are really two ways that I recommend you start if you want to play with RAG. Is either LangChain or Llama Index are good starting points. They don't really scale very well. That's why we wrote in a whole paper about it. But they're good starting points, good playgrounds. Okay, good. They have clean APIs. So you go, say, with LangChain, you get it from the document loaders. You get a directory loader. Feed your directory in it, and you want every PDF in it. And now papers is a data structure with all the PDFs. Okay. Now we will use a splitter. Okay. As I said, there are many ways to split: fixed size, recursive, document based, like layout, or semantic chunking. We will do semantic chunking and fixed size so that I can show you guys the difference. Now let's first do the character, like fixed size character based chunking. And every 1,000 character is a chunk here. Okay. And we have certain separators. We do the chunking right here, and let's explore the chunks. Okay, so this chunk starts here. As you can see, our parsing was not very good, because by default LangChain is using a parser that works very well on digital born PDFs, but not as, how to say, heavyweight as Nougat that I talked about in the talk. So this is one chunk. Let's look at the other. This is another chunk. Another chunk, and these are our chunks. Okay, so we split 7 papers into 361 chunks this way. Okay, now let's compare it to semantic chunking. So we will do semantic chunking on the State of the Union speech. Okay, and this is a TXT file. We read that in, we put that into a document object that we get from LangChain. And to do this, as you remember, semantic chunking slide, you need encodings, like you need to embed each buffer. Okay, so for that, we will get the MS Markov Distilbert and Nimble, neat, small, fast encoder. Put that on GPU. We get a semantic chunker. We will set our buffer size to 5. That is each sentence, 5 neighbors to its left, 5 neighbors to its right, 11 sentences in total, assuming there is 5 to its left and right. Okay. So with the semantic chunker, you split the documents, you create your buffers, you create your semantic chunks. And now you do the same thing with character text splitter. So this is like vanilla. I mean, recursive has some heuristic that maintains full sentences. Character text splitter, this is literally just 500 by 500 with an overlap of 150 between them. Okay, and separator is just an empty space. So let's explore. These are, first we'll print semantic chunks, then fixed size characters, fixed size chunks. If you look at semantic chunking, you see full sentences, right? Full sentence, full sentence, full sentence in the beginning. I mean, if you look at the end, See, another thing you see, variable length, right? Variable length. Because remember the slide, sentence 1 was one chunk by itself, the other 2 were a chunk, the other 3 were a chunk, right? Variable length. And if you look at them, like honestly, each sentence, each chunk ends with a full sentence. Okay, and we won't go into that much detail, but this whole thing is talking about the same idea. But that's what you expect from semantic chunking. If you look at fixed size character, okay, the first chunk, okay, these 2 chunks are starting with a sentence, good. This in the middle of a sentence, you see reform dot, not now, not, you see, this is what you get. And training an LLM on this will, you know, or doing RAG with this will only confuse the model. I mean, if you look at the ends, that's why I've called for a bipartisan what? You see? This is fixed size chunking. You know, so semantic chunking, we get 48 chunks. Fixed size chunking gives you 117. So that will tell you our average chunk is about what, 1,000 characters long in the semantic chunking, roughly. So now, since we have 7 papers and they're biomedical sort of domain specific models, we will get a PubMed word model to encode them with. Okay, initializing the model there. We use our biomedical encoder, the buffer size of 5, to semantically chunk our 5 papers. You see papers object that we created from that directory of 7 papers. Okay, now we semantically chunk them. And these are semantic chunks that we get from our 7 papers. You see, like it actually put the citation into one chunk. Then we embed the chunk text using a transformer and put them in a face vector database. If you remember the anatomy slide, right? You get a vector store, in this case it's FICE. You put your semantic chunks and you put your encoder, right? Like text model, in this case, the PubMed word encoder. You get text vector embeddings and you put them in a vector data store like FICE for similarity search. And that's what we're doing here. You see with like a couple lines of code. I mean, here, 1 line of code, you're doing this whole operation. That's why I'm saying start with something like LangChain or Llama Index. And you actually, you know, the way this is built is that you query the vector database object when you do retrieval, semantic search. Say you retrieved the top 3 nearest documents. And what was our question? Do we have any information on publications about RF diffusion? Okay, RF diffusion is a method that was released years after PubMed BERT was trained. So there is no way it was ever in its training data. Okay, I want to make that clear. And let's look at what it retrieved. Okay, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this is talking about RF diffusion. This is talking about RF diffusion. This is talking about RF diffusion significantly outperforms existing methods. To make it clear, I mean, there are 7 papers there. One of them is talking about RF diffusion. So when you look at our top 3, all 3 we got are RF diffusion related papers. So that's a precision of 100%. Recall, I don't know. That depends on how many RF diffusion chunks are in your vector store. Now, we will initialize an LLM that we will use to feed these retrieved chunks along with our prompts to answer a question. For that, let's use Flan T5. Again, I mean, these are tiny models compared to like what's the state of the art, but this is what I could run on a Google Google Cloud work environment. So, you know, you import from the Transformers auto tokenizer, auto model for sequence to sequence LLM, and pipeline. Then you get your tokenizer or Flan T5 large, get the model, you build a Hugging Face pipeline with the tokenizer and the model, and this is what the pipeline is for. Then you create your LLM. Sorry, you create a Transformers pipeline here. Then you create a Hugging Face pipeline with that, some temperature, some hyperparameters here for generation. I'm not going to talk. I mean, temperature is basically be deterministic. Like you want a more narrow sampling. The higher the temperature, the more creative the model will get. That is, that it will sample from how to say, more of the probability distribution available to it at each token. Max length, maximum tokens. Then you go on, put up a prompt template. A template that I like to use is something like, you know, a bit of a pep talk. You're an honest and helpful AI. You're always truthful and concise. Please answer the question with the provided context. If you don't know it, say, I don't know, okay? Context. This context is going to be retrieved content. Question is going to be what the user asked. Helpful answer is what the model will fill, okay? So from LangChain chains, you create a retrieval QA chain. You initialize the QA chain with your LLM, your chain type, your retriever, which was that vector database object that we created with the documents. And then you query, okay? This is like you query the QA chain. What technique proposed in 2023 can be used to predict protein folding? So PubMed BERT came recently after BERT was released, and that's around 2017. So definitely not 2023. So the model goes and says Rosetta fold diffusion, RF diffusion. So this is a piece of information that came from RAG, a new piece of information that made available to the model without changing the underlying model at all. I mean, you didn't see any code where we were tinkering with the model itself, fine-tuning it or whatnot, right? Now, let's ask, where was the RF diffusion paper published? And the model goes and says Nature, which is true, because if you go Rosetta Fold, you'll see that it was a Nature article, like in the journal Nature, it was published. But see, I put this one here to show that this is not a end all be all, you will answer everything type of situation. I mean, yeah, when you ask, what can I use RF diffusion model for? It will go and say, I don't know. And that will take you to this anatomy, and then you will say, oh, what went wrong? Did I parse wrong, chunk wrong, use the wrong encoder? Am I not using a good enough LLM to generate the responses? What? You see, that's the downside of RAG, too many moving components. Well, all right, thank you so much for listening to me. This was the end of my presentation. This is my contact information. I'm more than happy to chat with anyone who's interested in learning more about it. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Thanks, Ozan.
Of course.
Okay, so there's a question in the chat. Is there any time for updating the raw data and even knowledge that is provided for the RAG? I mean, after a while, for example, some mechanical science would be updated and previous data can be seen as not useful.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you need to keep your external source relevant, right? I mean, actually, Google sort of paved the way for this retrieval augmented generation technique with their paper Retrieval. And their use case there was removing problematic, sort of toxic, inflammatory content. And, what they did is they encoded everything that the model can use to answer a question. And when a user would go and file a complaint about an answer, they would find the source of that answer that was retrieved, and they removed it from the database. Okay, so you need to do the same thing so that the model couldn't use that toxic piece of information next time for answering a question. So the same kind of idea can be applied when a scientific hypothesis is debunked. You can go and remove all of the papers that were talking about that. Or some academic fraudulence was discovered, the same thing. Something, I don't know, right, like that. It really depends on the user and who maintains the data set. But the method gives you a way of putting in new information and taking out old information or unwanted information without having to deal with fine-tuning the model or trying to get it to unlearn something. Decoupling the model and the knowledge source to some extent, yeah. I hope that was helpful. Any other questions?
Yeah, this is really fascinating. Ozan, how do you think about bringing this is sort of in the tech side that you've shown all this work, right? But if you want to bring, and I think you were sort of starting to discuss some of that, right? So if you have all these domain-specific foundation models, right, that have their own sort of taxonomy and tokenization and so on, how do you think about, I mean, the knowledge that they might have access to, right, may not quite fit this style so cleanly, right? So how do you think, yeah, so how do you think you can sort of seamlessly integrate these things into those kinds of models? Maybe take Gen SLM as an example and sort of maybe if you can suggest some ideas there.
Yeah. So the question is how could we bring different domains of data or different modularity maybe of data and use them in the same RAG pipeline? Is that the question?
Yeah, so think of the base foundation model now not as an LLM, but or not as a sort of general purpose language model, but one of these domain specific models, right? That takes only certain kinds of things as input, right? So in that context, right, how do you think about preparing? And I guess it gets to sort of the question of how do you store the external references and all those aspects, right, in a format that is compatible for that particular kind of domain specific model, right? So just trying to think about how one might be able to sort of do that.
Right. I mean, domain-specific data requires a domain-specific encoder, in my opinion. If you're working with, say, in drug discovery, with SMILE strings, you probably need a SMILES encoder. If you use with something like GenSLM, you need a codon encoder. For protein language models, you need an encoder for amino acid sequences. Each have different tokenizers. So you could encode data using those, specific encoders into a vector space, and retrieve from that to whatever generator is gonna generate that type of data, like feed that into there. Like at the end of the day, it's all next token prediction, whether it's a next word or a next amino acid or a next smiles token, doesn't matter. So, but one exciting thing can be done there is that if you apply some contrastive learning to, say, embedding of an image and embedding of its caption, you can have RAG go from the description, natural language description of an image, to the closest images in an external source, and vice versa. Like you could do actually image translation with RAG even. You know, you could feed an image, encode it, and retrieve the nearest text representation from your vector store, and present that to the user. So it can be used for image captioning. Obviously, the condition here is using something like a contrastive learning to, you know, now you have a text encoder, you have an image encoder, they both produce embeddings. And if these two, the image and the text, are relevant to each other, you make their embeddings close to each other. And you can use them interchangeably once you do that, which opens multimodal RAG opportunities. Microsoft has a paper on it. It's called MURAG, M-U-R-A-G, MURAG, multimodal RAG.
All right, great.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, thanks, Ozan. It was very,
course.
very clear, and thanks for the tutorial.
Thank you.
Very, very clean.